Welcome everybody back to the Cardboard Crash Course. My name is Ethan.
And I'm Albert.
And we're here today to discuss a improved abilities list for the D&D 5e weapons that we have all in this packet here.
Yes, so as I'm sure all of you know who play D&D 5th edition, many of the weapons feel very similar to one another. Pole arms, for an example, being like Glaive and Halberd, which are functionally identical. And with this packet, we've decided to go through, add a couple different variations to the weapons, some new keywords and abilities, and really bring each one out and give it a life of its own.
This is made with the intention that you already know how to play, and you're just wanting to add that extra little bit of flavor to your game session. So without further ado, let's go ahead and discuss each one by one. And if you do want this packet to follow along with, you can find it either in the description below or in our Discord, where we talk about D&D and other tabletop games behind me. Starting off with the most basic weapons in the game, the simple weapons with the club. This is basically just a stick that you've picked up and started hitting people with. It's a 1d4 bludgeoning weapon with the light property.
Right, and keeping in the spirit of the weapon, we decided to come up with an ability that we call Crushing Blow. Crushing Blow reads as follows. On a critical hit, the target must succeed on a Constitution saving throw or be incapacitated until the end of its next turn. Now, we didn't want to go too crazy with the club because at the end of the day, it is just a stick that you've decided to smack something with. But in that spirit, if you smack something hard enough, you could, to an extent, disable it or stun it. Now, we didn't want to go so far as to give it the stunned status effect because that is significantly more detrimental on a weapon, and we reserved that for some of the later weapons on this list. But we feel like incapacitated is significantly detrimental to any monster to be inflicted on to make it worth wielding a weapon of this type, so that if you do get a lucky crit with it, you can take a moment and club it out of whatever it was doing.
I know if I got smacked with a tree stump, I wouldn't be able to pick up my weapon for a couple seconds. The next up on our list is the Dagger. This is a 1d4 piercing weapon with the finesse and light properties, as well as a thrown distance of 20 feet or 60 feet with disadvantage.
Yeah. Dagger is one of the first weapons that I felt like needed addressing when we're coming up with this list, and it was one of the ones that inspired me to do this. Because functionally speaking, there is no reason your character would ever want to carry or use a dagger. I mean,
unless you fight a rust monster and you have nothing else.
It was just one of those ones that was there on the list because it felt like it needed to be. But statistically, you'd never pick it up. Why would you pick a weapon that's 1d4 piercing? Yeah, it's finesse, great. It's thrown, but so are a lot of other things. And it didn't really have any real clear purpose or function in the game short of just being the generic knife.
We didn't want to make it all of a sudden 10 times better, like a great sword, but something interesting it could have.
Right, so we gave it an ability referred to as Improved Razor Edge. This being the improved version of the ability. There is a normal Razor Edge you will see later in the video. But Improved Razor's Edge increases this weapon's critical hit range by 2. What we mean by that is that normally, when you roll your d20 on your attack, a natural roll of 20 scores a critical hit. While using a dagger, you would score a critical hit on a roll of an 18, 19, or a 20. If you were playing a subclass that can improve your critical hit range, such as Champion Fighter or, say, a Hexblade Warlock, for example, with its Hex, in those cases, it does stack with those abilities. That is the intention here. So Champion Fighters using daggers could expand their crit range significantly. And the thought behind that is a dagger, which is a weapon that takes skill and precision to wield, so that if you are willing to sacrifice the raw damage output of many of the other weapons on this list, or special abilities of those weapons, you are rewarded by a weapon which can consistently land critical hits far easier than any other weapon in the game.
That's perfect. Next up, just like the club, is the Great Club, a bigger hunk of wood. This is a 1d8 bludgeoning instead, and it has the two-handed property, as well as the new ability of
Crushing Blow. Yeah, didn't feel like we really need to reinvent the wheel on this one. I mean, if a club has Crushing Blow and is a one-handed weapon, then a Great Club also has Crushing Blow and is the two-handed version. So really, this is the difference on your end, is if you pick up a small stick or a big stick before you decide you're going to smash something. At the end of the day, they're both just a stick and will do the same thing, but this does give them far more versatility than their vanilla forms.
Really, the only difference as to whether I tell my players they picked up a club or a great club is how strong they are and how much of the tree they ripped out of the ground.
Exactly.
Next up is the hand axe. This is a 1d6 slashing weapon with the light and thrown properties. Throwing it would be 20 feet or up to 60 feet with disadvantage.
Yeah, this is the first of the axes on the list, and I'm sure you're going to pick up something as you watch this video, that we try and keep the weapons broken up into more or less family archetypes, so that all axes will function similar to one another, and all bludgeoning weapons will typically function more or less in the same regard. But this is the first time you get to see the ability that we have called Savage Strike. And what this ability does is, on a critical hit, the target must succeed on a wisdom saving throw or be frightened of the attacker until the end of their next turn. Now, the reason that we went for this on this ability specifically is because axes are powerful weapons in game and in real life. They are weighty, they do devastating blows. I mean, they're useful for chopping through trees and enemies alike. And with that in mind, on a critical hit with that much damage going at a target, it is safe to assume the target would be pretty jarred by that. They're going to be afraid of their attacker.
It's definitely a morale hit.
Yeah, this is more of a weapon that's going to affect an enemy's will to fight just as much as it will affect their ability to fight. I mean, you all have seen the barbarian who charges the dragon and gets that one good crit, and the next thing you know, the dragon's at half HP and reeling. I mean, this weapon embodies that. I mean, yeah, this is a hand axe. This is the smallest and lightest variant of the axes, but no less mighty, and it fills its same role.
Yep.
And this weapon has the thrown property, which I think is a fun interaction, where if the player is lucky enough to score a critical hit by throwing an axe on a target, there's a chance the target will be so intimidated by the player that they'll be frightened and therefore unable to charge back and keep them at bay. And I think that's an interesting interaction, one of the reasons I gave this weapon this ability.
Next up is the Javelin. This is also a 1d6 weapon. It is piercing instead of slashing this time. And it has the thrown property, up to 30 feet or up to 120 feet with disadvantage there.
Right, and what we decided to do with the Javelin is introduce a new status effect that we refer to as Pinned, a status effect that you will see recurring on most of our ranged weapons that have the capacity to do so. And the way Pinning Hit reads as its ability is, on a critical hit with a ranged attack, the target must succeed on a dexterity saving throw or be pinned. Now, the way this reads is specific so that you can't just pin something by making melee attacks with the Javelin, even though it is a melee weapon. And its weapon really comes into its own light when you're taking advantage of its thrown property. At the end of the day, it is a thrown weapon primarily that just happens to find itself on the simple weapons list so that you can use it as such. Now, the way Pinned as a status effect reads is as follows. A pinned creature is impaled to the ground, wall, or object by ammunition capable of pinning them in place. Attacks against the pinned creature have advantage. The pinned creature has disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. If the pinned creature moves 5 feet or more, it rolls one of its hit dice and takes that much damage, ending the condition. The damage is of the same type of the attack that pinned the creature. A creature may use an action to perform a medicine check against the pinning attack's DC on themselves or another pinned creature, ending the condition on a success. Now, this is flavored in several different ways. I didn't like the idea of nailing something in place and turning off its movement speed. There are already too many abilities in the game.
Stunned, incapacitated, there's so many that does this.
There's a menagerie of abilities.
It would be way too overpowered.
Exactly. This gives the victim, the pinned creature, the option of whether they would rather move immediately and just take the damage, or spend their turn and prevent the damage by performing their action. So
and some monsters may be much less affected by ripping something out of them, as others would be. So if you have a javelin stuck in you, maybe a dragon can just fly away and take very minimal damage compared to its total health pool. But smaller kobolds might die because they rip something out and may want to take the moment to pull it out effectively.
Exactly. And as a player, if a monster throws a javelin at you and pins you in place, now the player has some decisions to make. Is it better to take the damage and move on with their turn, or would they rather be safe and remove it carefully? Sure, a fighter might be able to just charge on through and ignore it, but will the wizard make that same decision? Don't know yet. Now, a line of this ability that I think is very important is the first one. A pinned creature is impaled to the ground, wall, or object by ammunition capable of pinning them in place. At the DM's discretion, even if they score a critical hit, the attack may not be able to pin the creature you've hit. If you are fighting an ancient red dragon, and the fighter fires their crossbow and scores a pinning hit, that's all well and good, but logically speaking, could that crossbow bolt really pin the dragon? Probably not. So use this ability at your DM's discretion. It's not meant to cause arguments around the table, more so just make a logical effect on a critical hit with ranged weaponry.
Next up is the Light Hammer. This is a 1d4 bludgeoning weapon with the light and thrown properties, 20 feet or 60 feet with disadvantage.
So we also give it Crushing Blow. At the end of the day, what is a hammer if not a fancy club? And this one is more of a shaped and efficient weapon. There has been some work put into it as reflected by its increased cost and its increased weight. But functionally, it'll function similar to your clubs. I mean, if you hit somebody for it, they're going to take a D4 bludgeoning, and if you crit them, they might end up being incapacitated. The difference here being this is a throwable weapon, which could be ideal if you, say, have fleeing enemies or charging enemies, and you don't want them getting further or closer to you. Perfect chance for your character to throw some hammers at them, knock them steady in their place, and potentially prevent them from completing whatever it is they're trying to achieve.
We still wanted to make sure there were a couple weapons that are statically better than others. It's basically, like you said, just a club with a little extra work done to it. Yeah. As such, you may be able to pick up a club in a forest, but maybe not a light hammer. Buying it in the city just gets you a little bit of a boost.
Beyond that, this gives the character several different thrown weapon choices. Thrown weapon fighting being one of the, at least at my tables, lesser used options. I mean, it comes up, but not as frequently. And with this, hopefully we'll be able to diversify the options the player has for throwing weapons. Something like a Javelin has increased range and the ability to pin. Light hammers can incapacitate targets, whereas, say, daggers have an increased critical hit range. So they all have pros and cons to your thrown weapon of choice. And the light hammer is simply the crushing variant of your throwing options.
Moving on to something a little more interesting, the Quarterstaff. This is also a 1d6 bludgeoning weapon. However, it does have the versatile property, which means if you're holding it two-handed, you can use a 1d8 instead of the 1d6 there.
Right. And with that in mind, I gave it a variant of the Crushing Blow ability, named Variant Crushing Blow. Real creative, I know. When it reads as follows. On a critical hit, the target must succeed on a Constitution saving throw or be incapacitated till the end of its next turn. So far, normal, yes. In addition, though, if the attack is made with both hands, the target is instead stunned. The reason I gave it this upgraded ability is to reflect the fact that the weapon will function differently depending on if you're swinging it with one hand or two. If you're doubling down and really swinging for the fences with your quarterstaff, you could probably stun something with it with a solid connecting hit. However, if you're twirling it around in one hand, doing all your standard monk magic with it, because let's be honest, monks use quarterstaffs the most, then it might just only incapacitate them on a crit.
And monks might need a little bit of help anyway.
Yeah.
So a dual wield, or two-handed rather, will definitely boost a monk class up a little bit, especially in those early levels there.
Right. I mean, this weapon is one that's kind of, it's a stick. There's only so many ways you can flavor a stick, but it does function differently than most of the others. It's one of the only weapons in the game that does bludgeoning damage and is also versatile. And I wanted this ability to reflect that in the way that this weapon can function differently depending on how you're wielding it.
Yeah. Next up, we have the Sickle. This is a 1d4 slashing weapon with the light property and a couple new abilities.
Yeah, so with the Sickle, it is a weapon that's going to introduce two new keywords for the first time that you're going to see in this video. It has hooks and it has spikes. Now, anytime that we've given a weapon hooks, it also gets spikes. Those are a married set of abilities, but we wanted to make sure that they were broken apart separately because they do separate things. So the way hooks works is on a critical hit, the target must succeed on a strength saving throw or be grappled by the attacker until the end of its next turn, or the attacker uses the weapon to attack a different target. The idea here is that the Sickle is a hook. It's a handle with a long hooked blade. And the idea here is that when they get hit by it, they are literally captured by the weapon. They can't run away. You've got them. Well, that only works so long as you are continuing to get them with that weapon.
Right, and are strong enough to hold them there.
Exactly. So long as you can do that, great. You can grapple a target with this weapon on a crit. It's just an added bonus and kind of keep them in place. The Spikes ability comes into play in a little more of an interesting regard. Whenever a creature performs a shove action with this weapon, it can instead push the target 5 feet in any direction instead of only away from them. Typically, when you take a shove action in D&D, you push the target 5 feet away from you, or however far away from you it makes sense for them to go. Well, this weapon, if you're using it to shove, nothing says you couldn't hook them with it and throw them to the left or right.
Mm-hmm.
And
or even behind you.
Or behind you if you can somehow like maneuver around them as you do it.
Yeah.
So with this, it kind of gives you a little more agency to be a little more territorial and control the battlefield better. And it's a one-handed weapon with light, which gives you a lot of options of things you could do with it as well.
Backed up to a cliff, you might be a little more confident holding a sickle than any other weapon.
Mm-hmm.
It's not too powerful of an ability, but it makes sense in flavor.
Yeah, and it definitely sets it apart from other slashers and one-handed weapons like a dagger. I mean, this gives it its life pretty well, I think. It makes it pretty unique.
And now moving on to the spear. This is a 1d6 piercing weapon with the thrown property of 20 feet or 60 feet with disadvantage, as well as versatile, which means you can do a 1d8 piercing instead of 1d6 if you're holding it with both hands.
Right. The spear has often been called the king of weapons historically. I mean, it's been seen in most cultures around the world for many years, and it's incredibly versatile and diverse. And I want to
see it everywhere.
Yeah, and I want its abilities to reflect that, which is why it has several. To start with, it has pinning hit, much in the same way as Javelin, because it does have a thrown property, and it could pin just as well as a Javelin could.
Yep.
In addition to that, though, it has two abilities, both which new to this video, so I'll be reading them as follows. First being Charge Breaker. Opportunity attacks made with this weapon have advantage if you did not move on your last turn. This is to kind of imply that classic idea that if you plant your feet, set your spear, and are waiting for the opponent to come to you, you can get that quick strike in, and this would synergize well with feats such as Sentinel or Polearm Master, an already common combo that we see in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But that's not all a spear can do. You can also be very aggressive with a spear, charging forward with it leveled at your opponent, which brings us to its second ability called Forward Charge. If you move at least 20 feet in a straight line, mounted or not, before making an attack roll with this weapon, you gain a +1 to hit with that attack and a +5 to damage. The reason I worded this the way I did and set it up as it was designed is that this can actually synergize with the feat Charger, which is a feat I feel like is very good in concept.
Underutilized.
And rarely functions properly in game because it forces you to give up your attack action in favor of a dash, and then also burns your bonus action to make an attack. It's very rare I've seen my players use it. Hopefully with this ability it makes Charger a little more useful, but even if you don't take Charger, this ability on its own lets that player transition from more of a defensive role to an offensive role, bringing the fight to the enemy.
Yeah, really shows off how versatile the spear is and how much it's been used by all cultures.
Yeah.
We'll be moving away from the simple melee weapons now to the simple ranged weapons, which includes a lot of basic weapons you'd find all throughout history. Starting with the light crossbow. This is a 1d8 piercing weapon with ammunition, range of 80 feet or 320 feet with disadvantage. It's got loading and the two-handed property.
Right. So much like the javelin or the spear, this is a weapon that has a long spear-shaped piece of ammunition. It's a piercing weapon that can stick into you, and because of that, it has the pinning hit keyword. Most of the ranged weapons on this list that have a piece of ammunition of that style do in fact have pinning hit, and the light crossbow is no exception. The role this weapon functions in is that of a lighter option for a character who wants to do a little more damage. It's still a simple weapon, so classes can have access to it that wouldn't normally have access to, say, a longbow or a heavy crossbow, while still outputting a better damage number than, say, something like a shortbow would.
Yeah. Moving on to one of the more unique weapons, the dart. I honestly never see this used, so I'd love to see it used a little bit more. It's got finesse and the thrown property, 20 feet or 60 feet with disadvantage. It's a 1d4 piercing, and we give it a couple new abilities.
Right, so with the dart, the way I've always seen it is it can be seen as your conventionally a dart, but this also encompasses dedicated throwing knives or other such weapons throughout history. And in function, it's pretty much a dagger. I mean, it does the same damage type. It has pretty much close to the same range, I think. So we wanted it to reflect that in its similar form and function, except that this wasn't a weapon you can use in melee. So we thought we'd give it just a little more to make it reflect the fact that this is a dedicated ranged weapon, and as such, can function with feats like Sharpshooter, while the Dagger cannot.
Right.
So we gave this weapon Improved Razor's Edge. This is the only other weapon in the game to receive the Improved Razor's Edge, which increases its critical hit range by 2. But we also give it a new ability called Poison Darts. Poisons applied to this weapon's ammunition can coat twice as much ammunition as normal. Mm-hmm. So as where normally if you say used a poison and it told you could coat, 1 weapon or 5 pieces of ammunition or whatever that specific poison your DM gave you says it can use.
You'd be able to do 10 darts. This represents the dart's ability to barb into a target, and there's small surface area necessary to cover in order to apply that poison.
Exactly. So we see this as more of a weapon that can easily inflict poisons on a target. It's closer range, still thrown, but has that high crit chance, meaning that now, say, instead of your fighter having to stock up on, 50 daggers next time he's in town if he wants to use throwing knives, darts would fill that role just as well and would still thematically work the same way with a bit more utility.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Moving on to the Shortbow here. This is obviously one of my favorites. I had a very fun character named Mike who kind of ruined his campaign. Anyway, we've got a 1d6 piercing weapon, ammunition, of course, and it also has the range of 80 feet or 320 feet with disadvantage, and it also has the two-handed property, so it's got pinning hit as well.
Yeah. The difference between Shortbow and, say, the light crossbow really doesn't come from its abilities. They function very similarly in actual gameplay. It comes actually from its properties. Crossbow has loading, Shortbow does not. They both function in that simple ranged weapon category, so the classes that will be taking them are probably very similar.
Yep.
Your more martial classes and more experienced, like fighters, paladins, all that, are probably going to, unless they're a small-sized character, won't be seen taking a Shortbow. They'll probably go for, like, the longbow or the heavy crossbow. Right. But with that in mind, for those characters that will be taking this, you get the trade-off of a weapon that does a little less damage but doesn't have loading, freeing up a feat slot, or something like the light crossbow that does have loading and probably prompts you to have to take something like Crossbow Expert.
Yeah. Coming along to an incredibly unique weapon that I don't think I've ever seen in any campaign I've run or any player I've sat alongside. The Sling, a very cheap weapon, 1d4 bludgeoning damage. It has ammunition and a range of 30 feet or 120 feet with disadvantage there. The only thing that I think would make it fun to use is this ability that we gave it.
Right. We gave the Sling Crushing Blow. In fact, it's the only dedicated ranged weapon to get this ability.
Yeah.
And I like the idea that a player with a sling can wind up, tag a target at range, and just completely incapacitate them that turn if they get in the lucky enough hit.
Yeah.
I also made a slight change. Sling, as it exists in the player's handbook, actually deals piercing damage, which there is an argument to be made for that. It is a relatively small projectile moving very fast. It could definitely pierce into a target.
Yeah.
But for the sake of the thematic elements of this list and the way we wanted to interact with Crushing Blow, I did make the decision to change it to bludgeoning damage.
Yeah. So hopefully we see that a couple more times.
I'm looking forward to some players using this. Yeah.
All right. Moving into the fun weapons finally. We've got the marshals. His favorite. He
for sure
happened to ruin my campaign back a couple times with some of these. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this.
Gotta love the marshals.
Yeah. The Battleaxe, as of course the first one that we'll be talking about here. It is a 1d8 slashing weapon. It's got versatile, 1d10 instead if you're using 2 hands. As well as a fun new ability. Yeah,
this one has Savage Strike, much like the Hand Axe does. Yep. It fits in the same Axe Arch type category. This one can do some significantly more damage with versatile for that D10 if you're two-handing it, or if you're, say, wielding it with a shield or trying to dual wield it. Yeah. That D8 is still nothing to scoff at. I mean, this is still the same category that, Longsword fits into, one of the fan favorite weapons. So with the Battleaxe here with Savage Strike, you can really do some real damage, and that means that those frightened saves that the targets have to make will be much harder.
Yeah, really demoralize a group of enemies.
Yeah.
Now, moving on to a pretty fun weapon, the Flail, or at least we made it fun. It is a 1d8 bludgeoning weapon with no properties at all.
Yeah, as this weapon existed in vanilla D&D, it had a huge problem the way that it was a one-handed D8 weapon like Longsword or Battleaxe or some of the others. And that was it. There was no reason to take it. It didn't do anything fancy. It had nothing special, and it didn't even have versatile. There was literally no reason to pick this weapon over some of the others.
Unless your DM gave you a fancy magic one.
Yeah, and unless you're going for purely flavor or aesthetic reasons. And I personally love the Flail. It's one of my favorite weapons historically. I think it's really cool, and I really wanted to reflect the unique way it functions in its abilities, so I gave it 2 here as follows. Its first one's called Sweeping Blow. On a critical hit, the target must succeed on a dexterity saving throw or be knocked prone. As a chain weapon, a ball on a chain, sometimes spiked, sometimes blunt, this weapon can take you off your feet. It can trip you, it can pull you, it can knock you over. It has a lot of momentum behind it. Mm-hmm. But that's not all it is. I mean, this weapon isn't just a mace. It's not just a club. It's got some reach to it. But this weapon isn't quite a reach weapon. It's not a pole arm, no. So I gave it a property that we would call chain weapon. When you make an attack action while holding this weapon, you may extend its reach by 5 feet until the end of your turn. Mm-hmm. If you do, attack rolls made against you have advantage until the beginning of your next turn. This is to show the fact that this is a weapon that you can really wind up with its momentum, kind of reach out there and touch targets further away than you could of, say, a longsword or a battleaxe, but not without the added risk of exposing yourself to danger.
Extending yourself a little bit, possibly overextending yourself depending on the amount of enemies.
So this can give the players some agency to make those tougher calls. Is it better to move into the reach of the enemy and take some hits to hit up close, or can they safely, say, attack the enemy from, say, behind one of their allies, maybe behind the tank of the party or something like that, and get some free hits in, trusting the enemy isn't going to get close enough to them to take advantage of the fact that they are now at disadvantage. So I think it's a fun way to flavor it up, and hopefully we'll make it come out in its own unique light.
Perfect. Ooh, moving on to one of my favorites, the Glaive. This is a 1d10 slashing weapon. It's got heavy, reach, and two-handed. That was all it had initially. Yeah.
The Glaive is one of my personal favorite weapons as well, and many of my players at the table have picked it up, preferring the aesthetic over the Glaive over the Halberd. And the issue I've always had with these two weapons is that in vanilla D&D, they are the same.
Yeah.
Functionally, statistically identical, and that always really bugged me. So I went through and gave this weapon a couple of unique properties to make it come out more in its own light. The first one being Razor Edge. This is the normal version of it, the first time we're seeing it on this list, funny enough, and it improves this weapon critical hit range by 1, allowing this weapon, being a sword on a stick, essentially, to score those critical hits a little easier and to really land those devastating blows a little faster. And that follows up nicely with its secondary ability, which we call Critical Combo. And the way Critical Combo functions is as follows. On a critical hit, you may make a single additional attack with this weapon against the same target as part of that same attack action. Critical hits produced from this additional attack do not extend Critical Combo. Additional attacks made this way must be declared before rolling to attack. Which is to say, if you've got a fighter with multi-attack and he steps up to the bat, walks up, crits the target, he can immediately just make an extra attack right then and there against that same target as part of that action. Doesn't cost anything, doesn't stop him. And if for some miracle he crits again with his extra attack, well, he doesn't just crit for infinity. They don't just loop, otherwise paralyzed targets would just be turned into like a blender.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what they have to declare it. Like, the player needs to let the DM know before he makes the additional attack, hey, I just crit, I got this extra attack, I'm using it now, so that when he does score that extra crit by some chance or miracle.
Yeah, and this really shows off the prowess that you can have with a weapon like this. Really, it's we thought of the cool factor first and then built the rules around it.
Yeah, when you think of a Glaive as a polearm, you don't think of it as those giant crushing blows like you get out of some of the others. You think of it more as a flared weapon that you're going to use with great skill. You're coming up, you're twirling around, you're spinning about, you're slashing.
It's not quite a finesse weapon.
No, not quite. It's still got a lot of strength involved. So we didn't give it the finesse property, but we did want to reflect the fact that this is a weapon that requires an immense amount of skill to use in the same way that a sword does over something more like an axe, which, while still a skilled weapon, doesn't require the same years of training.
Well, speaking of weapons that don't need a whole lot of training and axes, we have the Great Axe up next. This is the greatest of the axes. This is a 1d12 slashing weapon. It's got heavy and two-handed, and that was all it had natively.
Right, and that's nothing to scoff at natively. I mean, there's only a couple weapons in the game that use a d12 for their damage die. That's a hefty damage die. I mean, you can do some real punishment to a monster with that, especially if you're comboing with features from classes like Barbarian or, Half Orc that give you more damage die when you crit. This thing can hit like a bus intrinsically, but that wasn't enough for us. We wanted to really push this weapon into its archetype of just a brutal, monstrous weapon that when it scores those critical hits are absolutely devastating on the enemy, which is why we gave it Savage Strike, but we also gave it Sweeping Blow. So that when you score that crit, they first have to make a wisdom save, and then they also have to make that dexterity save. Yes. And if they're already frightened of you, that's not going to go well. So that they end up on the ground, prone and frightened.
Unable to stand up, unable to get closer to you.
Advantage on all your attacks against them. And this is a weapon that when you score that crit, if that poor thing survives, we wanted it to be devastating and really reflect just the savage nature of the weapon.
Yep. Moving away from the greatest of the axes, we have the greatest of the swords, the Great Sword. So this has 3d4 slashing damage. You'll notice it's a little different, but it also has the heavy and two-handed properties.
Yeah. This is actually my favorite weapon, historically speaking, and in D&D. I think more of my melee fighters have used a Great Sword than any other weapon in the game.
You actually have one of your own in real life.
Yes, I do. It's prized possession of mine. But with that in mind, I wanted this weapon to reflect its archetype a little differently than some of the others, especially considering some of the other new weapons we added later in the list we'll get to. So this change will make sense here in a moment, I promise. First and foremost, I changed this weapon's damage type. Originally in the player's handbook, it deals 2d6, which is really good. That's not bad at all. That's exceptional. On average, far better than like the Great Axe would deal with 1d12. But I pushed it to 3d4, which will raise this weapon's damage on average per hit higher than any other weapon.
Roughly 9 to 10 damage.
Just about,
It would be the average, especially if you're applying Great Weapons Master.
Yeah, the fighting styles you can get from Fighter let you reroll the 1s and the 2s. I mean, you will consistently be doing high damage with this weapon, and that is the point. I mean, this weapon,
you are paying 50 gold for it.
In the player's handbook, it is the most expensive of the weapons you can buy. There's a reason for that. This weapon should reflect the cost of entry. It's a powerful weapon. But that's not all. We also gave it an ability, Improved Critical Combo, which is slightly different than the normal version, and it reads as follows. On a critical hit, you may make a single additional attack with this weapon against any target as part of the same attack action. And it goes on to say critical hits produced from this attack do not extend the yada, 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 just like the previous ones. The idea behind this is that while the normal critical combo is more of a flurry of blows against a single target, this brings into the light more of the classic
sweeping through an enemy, hitting someone else.
For those of you who played, say, 3.5, the Cleave ability, this is very similar to that, which to an extent was rolled into the Great Weapon Master feat. But we wanted this weapon to really just come through on its own and be able to just carve through hordes of enemies. It doesn't do as many fancy status ailments. It doesn't do anything technical like, say, the Great Axe did with the fact
just a lot of damage to a lot of guys.
Yeah, this weapon exists for one reason and one reason only, to hit like a truck. And I think with the changes we've made, it will do it really well.
All right. We've got the Swiss Army knife of weapons coming up next in the Halberd. This has a 1d10 slashing damage archetype, and it also has the heavy, reach, and two-handed properties. Nothing to scoff at all.
No. As I previously mentioned, this weapon is functionally identical to the vanilla Glaive in the player's handbook, which always bugged me immensely because they are different weapons in the use. And I want this weapon to reflect that, so it gained 3 abilities: hooks, savage strikes, and spikes.
Yep, we've already discussed hooks,
we have
spikes, and savage strike all on their own.
But together, they let this weapon do something very unique. Because now you have a weapon that, on crits, you've got that large axe blade, the Halberd. It can frighten your targets just like any of the other axes would, keeping them at bay. Well, at the same time, you have the hooks, which will let you more or less hold them in place. So not only are they frightened of you, they can't get away. So whichever going to end up first, they end up being frightened longer or grappled. They're stuck there. You've got them. And on top of that, there's the spikes ability. So you can fully reposition the enemies you're fighting. And this is a weapon with reach, which means if you're taking shove actions against a creature 5 feet away from you, you can push them out of your reach. You can pull them closer into melee. You can put them left or right.
Weapon.
This weapon was designed from the ground up for us here to be a crowd control weapon. This is a weapon that you take against a horde of enemies and completely control where every single one of them are at any given time. and use it to just brutalize a crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. The DM may hate this a little bit, but it's a good thing that we're keeping these to the critical hits, because I really think the player agency should shine through in these weapons, while not, making it a headache for everybody else at the table.
It shouldn't slow down combat to use these. You should just make those crits, when they happen, shine even brighter and have more memorable moments.
Yes, absolutely. All right, Albert, we are getting into one of our original weapons.
Yes.
It's not too original, of course, and I'm sure in many Asian-themed campaigns you see plenty of these. But we've got the Katana. This is a 1d8 slashing weapon. It's got versatile for 1d10, and it also has finesse, showing off that very high skill that you need for this. But
yeah, I've seen a lot of suggestions from other homebrews, and I think even in the Dungeon Master guides makes a note that you can reskin some weapons as another, and often katanas are simply reskinned longswords that have finesse.
They're not, though.
But they're not. Yeah. They are functionally different weapons and behave differently in combat, and we wanted this weapon to reflect that if this is something you would see in a setting that you are running at your DM's discretion, of course.
You've got pros and cons of both of them.
So the katana, we gave the razor edge ability, so it does improve that crit range slightly, which is inherently really good. I mean, it's a razor sharp weapon designed for cutting. It could get some savage crits in there. Yes. But we also gave it a new ability, and this is the first time we are seeing it here on this list, called Sword Flourish. And the way it functions is when you take the attack action while holding this weapon, you can choose to make all of the attacks made with it this turn at disadvantage. If you do, you make an additional attack roll with it as part of the original attack action. Mm-hmm. So if you would make one attack, you may make two. If you would make two, you instead make three. All the trade-off, you would have disadvantage. So you get to choose. If you're fighting, say, a horde of low armor class monsters, say goblins or kobolds, and you feel pretty confident in your ability to deal with them in a competent manner, maybe you can extend that with a sword flourish and take out a couple extra per turn. Mm-hmm. Or if you're fighting something that's bigger and tougher and you really are scraping just to hit that armor class on the head, okay, then maybe you'll give up that extra attack and you're going to go straight for the higher rolls with no disadvantage. But this weapon gives you the choice, and it can reflect the high level of swordsmanship used by a wielder of this weapon.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final note, with Sword Flourish, the way it's worded in particular, with Action Surge, you can actually choose to begin to Sword Flourish during that Action Surge with the second attack action that you're taking in the turn.
Yes.
Which was completely on purpose. It shows you might be a little more proficient the first time around and be a little more careful, but if you see this enemy start to get really damaged, you may become a little more careless with it.
And with that, you can go in and make the first couple attacks and follow up a couple of razor fast attacks. If you think you might be able to finish them off, you're that close and it's worth the risk, you can go for it, or maybe you play it safe.
Right. Yeah. All right. Moving on to your mounted weapon, the lance. This is very, very situational, and I think we pulled off showing that off. So we've got a 1d12 piercing damage, nothing to scoff at all, but it's also got the reach and heavy properties there.
Right, so this is a weapon that I had to do a little bit of tweaking with to make it work in the way I think it was intended to work originally. Inherently speaking, the lance was one of the few weapons in the player's handbook that had a special ability already that gave it some interesting rules, and it reads as follows. You have disadvantage when you use a lance to attack a target within 5 feet of you. Also, a lance requires 2 hands to wield when you aren't mounted. Right. This ability applies even if you are not proficient with this weapon. We added that last line ourselves, of course, but it's a strange weapon in the way that it actually gives you penalties when you're using it unless certain conditions are met. Mm-hmm. First of all, you don't want to be too close to your target because it's such a long and unwieldy weapon. You can't actually hit them effectively. And second of all, if you're not mounted, now you need 2 hands to hold it, which always struck me as strange that it didn't actually have the heavy property originally. Right. So we went ahead and gave it the heavy property because it logically would make sense for it to have it. And it also lets it now function with the Great Weapon Master feat, which I feel like is a good interaction for a weapon of this type. But now you have a weapon that deals a d12 piercing that has the potential to be wielded one-handed, which opens you up to, say, using a shield, boosting your armor class a bit. And with all that combined, we thought the perfect ability to give this would be the forward charge ability that you saw featured on our spears from earlier, really letting you make the most of those big forward cavalry charges and drive it home with a bit more accuracy and a lot more damage.
Specified it also works in mounted combat.
Right, that is a line I made sure to include specifically for the lance, given that is the most likely chance to be used.
Maybe the cavalier fighter may actually feel like a cavalier while holding one of these.
Or all those paladins out there summoning your rounds.
All right. So this is the most common weapon in the game, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the Longsword. Not much to say about it inherently. It's a 1d8 slashing with versatile 1d10. Just the most...
Yeah, you think classic fantasy, you think the Longsword. I mean, it's the staple of...
It's not bad.
It's not bad. It's the poster child of classic fantasy. You think knights in armor, you think longswords. You think, big mainstream media fantasy, you think longswords.
Boromir had one. Aragorn had one.
Everybody in Game of Thrones had one. I mean, it's the weapon of choice for most fantasy, and it, historically speaking, was a status symbol. It was a very common, widespread weapon. It takes a good deal of skill to use, though. This is actually the weapon that inspired the improved critical combo ability, which it has. It's the only ability we've opted to give it. And some of the other swords on this list were then derived from this. This is the one that we thought about the most when we were building it around, because it is the staple weapon. It's the one that you can use in two hands, you can use in one hand. All the kids, when you're playing, when you're young, you're knights and dragons and all that, they all have long swords. It's what they use. And we want that to be reflected in its ability. This is an ability that when you produce it, you feel like a hero.
So just like that great sword, you can do this critical combo against any target. So you're either fending off the same foe in a duel, fending off multiple foes if you're getting swarmed by goblins or whatever. But you've got that versatile option, which is it's kind of an ability on its own. Right,
and in that way, we didn't feel like giving this weapon too many abilities. We feel like the critical combo and improved critical combo abilities on their own are very powerful.
Yes, almost a feat.
Yeah, and in that way, I feel like Longsword with its versatile capabilities and improved crit combo
doesn't really need much else.
Perfect.
Yep. Next up, we've got the Maul. This is 2d6 bludgeoning. This holds that original Greatsword's amount of damage. But in bludgeoning, of course, it's got the heavy and the two-handed properties. So just a big hammer right now.
And we wanted to really ham up the fact that this is the biggest, heaviest weapon that's going to hit.
Yep.
It's a Maul, and that's what they do. They hit and they demolish whatever they strike. So yeah, while it still does 2d6 and we up the Greatsword to have slightly higher damage on average, 2d6 is nothing to scoff at. I mean, this is consistently going to do really good damage. And on top of that, I gave it some really nice abilities. The first time we're going to see on this list, the Ultimate Crushing Blow, one of only 2 weapons featured here to have it. On a critical hit, the target must succeed on a Constitution saving throw or be stunned until the end of its next turn. And that is just such a debilitating status effect.
Yeah.
I mean, when this weapon hits, when it crits, it's going to do catastrophic damage and really put an enemy into a place where it has no business doing anything back to you.
No, it gets bonked on the head.
It gets bonked on the head and falls over. Speaking of falling over, we also gave it Sweeping Blow, because this is a weapon that you're going to wind up and just swing for the fences with. And with that, I feel like the Sweeping Blow, knocking things prone, fits so well with it being stunned.
Stunned and knocked prone. I can imagine I would be both of those, getting hit in the head.
Yeah, I mean, anything that survives the hit is not going to survive the follow-up flurry of damage from the rest of the party coming out of this poor, demoralized, smashed to bits, and near unconscious thing laying on the ground. So
yeah, absolutely. And with it being 2 separate abilities, on a critical hit, they may survive one, or they may pass one check and fail another. And
of course,
it makes it just that much more flavorful.
And of course, if they do end up getting stunned, that not going to do so well on that dex save, which they're going to fail. But this is one that's one of those weapons that just, if the fighter is swinging around a Maul, if the paladin's swinging around a Maul, whatever they crit on is going to be having a bad day.
Yep. Moving on to another unique weapon on this list, the Morningstar. I can admit that when I started playing D&D, I had no idea this weapon existed, but after a few years of it, I love it. It is a 1d8 piercing weapon with no properties, and inherently that wasn't too interesting.
No, it was pretty much statically a worse Rapier at first, because it had no properties, whereas it had finesse. And I don't know why anyone would have picked this weapon short of you wanting to live out your, Lord Sauron fantasies, swinging around a giant spiked mace.
I think it's really cool.
I think it's a really cool weapon, which is why I want to give it some good abilities to reflect that. and I gave it Razor's Edge and Crushing Blow. This is the only weapon on the list that features that combination of abilities. I feel like as a large, heavy, weighted object on a stick, it's going to definitely...
With spikes.
Let's not forget the spikes. It's going to have that Crushing Blow. It's going to be able to incapacitate things that hits on crits. But the spikes, I feel like, would just make it that much easier to land those crits, which is why I decided to improve its crit range ever so slightly.
Yep. All right, another homebrew weapon.
Yep.
This one also comes from Eastern culture, sort of similar to the katana in the way the longsword and greatsword are similar. This is the greatsword of the katana. This is the Odachi. It is a 2d6 slashing weapon, very similar to greatsword's original damage there. It also has heavy and finesse, which is a weird combination. But
only one in the game as of our creation that has this. I felt like
of all weapons to have it
would be this one.
Yeah.
I mean, because this is a weapon that's very skillful, you could definitely wield it with great dexterity, but at the same time, it's big.
Yeah.
This is no small weapon. This is not a katana. This is the great sword of the East. I mean, and with us wanting to add this weapon to the game and bring it into its own light, I felt like that's one of the reasons I bumped the damage on the greatsword ever so slightly, because this weapon gets the same abilities as a katana. It gets Razor Edge. It gets Sword Flourish. I mean, this is essentially a vanilla greatsword that crits a little bit better and has the option to make some extra attacks. That's crazy good on its own.
Yep.
And I didn't know how to add it to the game without making the greatsword almost irrelevant, which is one of the reasons the greatsword went from 2d6 to 3d4, is because this weapon now exists. And this is now a weapon that your fighter can take, even if they're, say, a dex fighter, and they can make great use of this. I mean, as terrifying as it sounds.
As long as you're not a gnome dex fighter.
Sorry for all you small-sized characters out there. This is a heavy weapon, and it's not going to go great for you guys. But for those dex fighters out there who still want to wield weapons of two hands, this is an interesting option that should allow some new character builds we haven't really seen before.
Yep.
Frightening concept. This is a weapon with finesse, which means you can sneak attack with it. So, ever want to see a rogue with a greatsword? Here's your choice.
All right, moving on to the pike. Sort of similar to a spear, but we'll see how it's different here in a minute.
Pike is the spear, as longsword is a greatsword.
Yep. This is a 1d10 piercing weapon. It's got heavy, it's got reach, and it's got the two-handed property. And a couple of abilities.
So I actually designed this weapon first before I went through and designed the spear. This one I gave Charge Breaker and Forward Charge, two abilities we've already gone over.
Yep.
And it really reflects the way this weapon would have been used. Historically, pikes were very common throughout most of history and most cultures in the same way spears were. And they often you'd see the cavalry charge running against the pike wall and being decimated, which is where the thought behind the Charge Breaker ability came in, that advantage on your opportunity attacks. But like I said, once with the spear, you can set this weapon to attack and absolutely do a forward charge with it and do some good damage. And I wanted to make sure it had both of those. Combining that with the fact that it's got reach and does a d10 damage, this weapon is nothing to scoff at. And while it doesn't do anything as fancy as, say, something like the Halberd might or the Glaive, you should see some consistently good results with this weapon and allow your fighters to transition well between an aggressive role or a defensive one.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. One of the most fancy vanilla weapons we've got, fancy in terms of the way of fighting with it, we've got the Rapier. This is a 1d8 piercing weapon, and it has finesse. And that really made it interesting in vanilla.
Yeah. In vanilla, this was the weapon that had the highest damage die and had finesse, which meant it was a great pick for your dex-based fighters. It was a fantastic pick for your rogues, rangers. A lot of characters that really benefit from having high dexterity would pick and use the Rapier. And with some of the changes we made to some of the other weapons, I didn't want to make it feel useless. I didn't want the Rapier to fall by the wayside because it is a fantastic weapon and very interesting to see. And so I gave it Razor's Edge because if there's any weapon that deserves to have an improved crit range, it would be a Rapier. They're very precise. But I also gave it critical combo, much like the Glaive has.
So is this the only weapon with this combination?
No, the Glaive also has it, but this is the only one-handed weapon that does, and certainly the only finesse weapon that does. So with that in mind, it is a great option for someone looking to use a d8 damage die on a one-handed weapon with a boosted crit range and the ability to make follow-up attacks. Kind of hard to pass on that.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Next, coming up, we have another original homebrew weapon. This, of course, we're not the first ones to come up with stats for it. But a player in one of his games currently actually requested to see this. So I'm looking at you. The weapon is a rope dart. It is a 1d4 slashing weapon. It has finesse, reach, and two-handed properties. So that allows you to use your dex, but at a very far range. With having to hold it two-handed the whole time.
So yeah, with this weapon, the first thing that came to mind when I started studying out was I thought about the whip, which is a weapon we'll come to later, but already exists in vanilla D&D, and that was where I took a lot of my inspiration from how to build it. Mm-hmm. But the more I thought about it, I realized this weapon will function very differently than a whip would. It's not going to do the same thing.
It's basically a dagger at the end of a chain.
Yeah, you're swinging around this knife on a string, pretty much, hitting things at range, and that's hard to do, and especially hard to do accurately. So I wanted to make sure that its abilities reflected that, starting off with a special ability in which you have disadvantage when you use the rope dart to attack a target within 5 feet of you. This applies even if you're not proficient with the weapon, because in order for you to really get the momentum necessary to make those attacks, reach out and touch something, and use those kind of flowing, twirling movements that a weapon like this would require, you couldn't really do that something close up. It's almost a ranged weapon, except it's still
It's slightly
melee.
Worse than a dagger in melee.
Yes.
So it's like holding a dagger with the 1d4, but you have this huge, bulky chain attached to it if you're holding it all.
Yeah. With that in mind, it is similar to a dagger, but not quite. So I did give it Razor's Edge, improving its crit range by 1. I felt like that was very appropriate for a weapon like this. It'd be very precise.
Yep.
But on top of that, I gave it Chain Weapon, which, as we went over earlier, you can extend its reach by 5 feet if you are willing to take the disadvantage on attacks coming into you.
Is this the first weapon with a 15-foot range?
It is for sure in our games. Yes. On this list, this is the only weapon that can natively reach a 15-foot reach.
And melee.
In melee, as a melee attack, meaning it still qualifies for all your smites, it still qualifies for all those other fancy abilities you can do.
With an improved critical range.
With an improved critical range. So this is a weapon that could consistently hit targets that most other weapons couldn't. And of course, the trade-off for this is it does take both hands, and if things getting close to you, you're going to have a bad day.
And it's only 1d4.
And it's only 1d4.
Yes. Yep, you're really going to have to take advantage of this weapon to make it, as powerful as it can be, because it's not inherently insane.
No, this is not a weapon for everyone. This is not a weapon for every situation, but for the situations in which it will shine, I think it will shine brightly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm about to run a pirate campaign with the whole crew. And one of my characters... made by the players there is looking to be a swashbuckler rogue. So yes, of course. I'm very excited to show this one off. The Scimitar. It is a 1d6 slashing weapon, and it has finesse and light in the player's handbook. But you gave it...
Yeah, I gave it a couple new abilities here. I gave it Sword Flourish and Critical Combo. It's the only one that features both.
Yes.
I thought it was important this weapon had both these abilities, because these abilities are both ways that you can produce further attacks on your turn using it, either by taking disadvantage coming in at you, or on critical hits being able to put out even more attacks. And I thought
no matter what, you're doing a lot with it.
Yeah. I want this weapon to have the potential to make a lot of attacks, because it's a flowing, slashing weapon that's going to chain one hit into another over and over and over again. And yeah, it only does a d6 when compared to some of the others, which can put out a d8 or a d10. But I wanted the trade-off to be worth it, that you have that chance for higher attacks. I mean, you think Scimitar, you think Indiana Jones, the guy twirling that sword. You think pirate movies, you think Pirates of the Caribbean.
One hand behind their back, fighting on the
slashing rapidly back and forth. I mean, not all the attacks are going to land, sure, but you're going to make enough attacks. You're going to get the job done.
Yeah. All right, moving on to another homebrew weapon. We've got the Scythe. This is notably not a war scythe, though it functions very similarly. Think of Ruby, kind of.
Yeah, this is your classic Grim Reaper scythe.
Yes, this is what the Grim Reaper or a generic farmer may have as a unique weapon. It's a 1d10 slashing weapon. It's got finesse, reach, two-handed.
Right. This weapon is one that does not exist in standard D&D, and that always kind of bothered me, because the Sickle does. And the whole idea behind the Sickle as a melee implement is a weapon commonly used by farmers, as is a scythe. And in history, it's very common for farming implements to become weapons of war. And in D&D, inspired by these things, a scythe makes perfect sense as another weapon that any of your players should have an access to in their arsenal. And beyond that, let's be honest, they're cool. I've been asked several times in my campaigns by players, hey, can I have a scythe?
We actually homebrewed one.
We did.
It ended up being overpowered because we didn't think
about
it
we had no prior thought into it. But this should be a set of rules that allows you to use one effectively and have its own unique role in the battlefield. And they are as follows. It has Razor's Edge, improving its crit range by 1. It's a giant sharp blade on a stick. I think it's appropriate. It's going to function a lot like a glaive. It also has a version of hooks called Giant Hook. On a critical hit, the target must succeed on a strength saving throw or be restrained by the attacker until the end of its next turn, or until the attacker uses weapon to attack a different target. The idea behind this being that this is such a large hooked implement. If you catch something with it on that crit, not only are you going to stop them from moving around, you're going to be able to get those further attacks with them at advantage because now you've got them hooked pretty thoroughly.
Yep.
And it has spikes as well. So just like the Halberd, it can well reposition enemies on the battlefield. The difference between this weapon and the Halberd is that whereas the Halberd focuses more on absolute crushing blows that are going to frighten your enemies and injure them and move them around the battlefield, this weapon is more functioned on catching one enemy and putting them right where you want them. Yeah.
This will probably work the best in a duel. I can imagine a lot of NPCs may have this weapon.
Farmers for sure.
Yep. Yeah. So it just, like you said, it just made sense to include in the game. Another bread and butter of medieval and Renaissance weaponry. This is the Shortsword. It is a 1d6 piercing weapon with finesse and light.
Right. So the Shortsword is part of the family of 3 swords I've always thought was like the main trio of fantasy, being Shortsword, Longsword, Greatsword, and I want them to function similarly because they are pretty much the main weapon resized. So you take the longsword, you shrink it, you get a short sword, you blow it up bigger, you got a great sword. And I want them to all function similarly. And the short sword is halfway between a longsword and a dagger. And so it's got elements of both. It has Razor's Edge, improving its crit range by 1, which makes sense. It's close enough to a dagger that it's going to have some improved crit range, but not so close it's going to improve by 2.
Yes.
However, being similar to a longsword, it still functions with improved critical combo, which is going to let this weapon crit easier than any of the others with improved crit combo. And when it makes those crits, it's going to be able to make a lot of attacks on a lot of different targets. I mean, this is a weapon that's going to be really good at putting out a lot of attacks and doing some decent damage. And that should offset the fact that it only does a d6. And I think that the trade-off here, whereas this weapon has Razor's Edge and improved crit combo but does a d6, balances nicely against the Rapier, which has regular critical combo but does a d8. So it's the decision the player gets to make over, would I rather do better crits at less damage or have a better neutral game with a higher damage die in general, but my crit game is a little worse.
Moving on to the Trident. Another one that they'll probably see a lot in my pirate campaign, of course, very nautical. This is a 1d6 piercing weapon, sort of similar to a spear or a javelin. But because it has the thrown property, 20 feet, 60 feet with disadvantage, and versatile of 1d8 instead of that 1d6 there. So really kind of whatever you want it to be. But it wasn't quite different enough.
No, unfortunately in vanilla D&D, it was pretty much identical to the spear, except it cost more, which kind of sucked and didn't have any benefits to show for it. And so while we took the spear into that kind of generalist role for all-purpose use in combat, either one-handing or two-handing or throwing or melee or whatever, Trident we gave Razor's Edge. I mean, it functions just like a spear, but it's got 2 extra barbs on it. So with those extra barbs, you're going to be able to score those hits a little more easily, which makes sense as to improving its crit range. And given that this weapon still has pinning hit as a thrown weapon that could pin, this is the weapon that should be able to pin targets more consistently than any other. And that makes sense given its design. So
double the chance to pin any weapon, and with that thrown property, this actually makes it useful. I can imagine throwing this at somebody's chest definitely has a higher chance to hit their heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, moving on to another kind of unique weapon. This is the Warpick. It's sort of similar to a hammer mixed with a Maul.
Bit of a spike.
Yes, yeah, but this is a 1d8 piercing weapon. No properties. So really kind of boring.
Yeah, another one
Again.
of those weapons that was pretty much functionally identical to the Morningstar before our adjustments to it here. And
Why even have it?
it was our problem. But we do have it, and with that in mind, we've given it some fun abilities to kind of bring it out into its own light.
Nice little cherry.
Yeah, this weapon has hooks and spikes, which it's a giant spike. I mean, this weapon, if any weapon deserves it, this one does. We also give it crushing blow, so it can incapacitate targets. It's a one-hander. This is a one-hander that, much like the Sickle, can reposition targets and grapple them in place, but it can also stun them. So not only can you catch a target with it and grapple them on a crit, you can also incapacitate them, which is really good. You can get a target and just lock them down. All with a one-handed weapon that lets you still utilize a shield.
One side is moving them around, and the other side is hitting them as hard as you can.
This is a weapon that will let you get real good aggression against a single target, lock them down good without sacrificing your defenses.
Right. Moving on to the Warhammer, the small version of the big bonky boy, the Maul. This is a 1d8 bludgeoning weapon. Can be held in one hand. It's got versatile of 1d10 instead of 1d8, which has made it unique in a way, but not
very similar to the Battleaxe and the Longsword.
Yeah, really not unique enough.
No.
So
given this is a one-handed weapon, given that this is a weapon that you can use in two hands, I wanted to make sure it really stepped out into its own light, which is why I gave it ultimate crushing blow. And nothing else.
Yeah.
This weapon, it's going to be able to get those stunning hits, just like your Maul. But it's not quite as big. You're not going to be sweeping guys off their feet with it.
Right. You can still hold a shield.
Yeah, you can still use a shield with it. But this thing can absolutely put somebody on their butt.
Yep.
And stun them.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Okay. And finally, for the melee weapons, we have the whip.
Would be good.
This is a unique weapon. Really meant for its ability here that it's got over the damage type.
Yeah.
Which is a 1d4 slashing. It's also got finesse and reach. All makes sense, but you also give it a ability.
Prior to our changes in vanilla D&D, this is the only finesse weapon that also had reach, which made it at least have its own niche in the game, if nothing else. But with some of the changes we've made to the other weapons, we felt like this weapon needed to really have its own space. Which is why I gave it the ability Ensnaring. On a critical hit, the target must succeed on a strength saving throw or be grappled by the attacker and restrained until the end of its next turn, or until the attacker uses his weapon to attack a different target. I mean, this is a weapon that you can be at a distance from the target and absolutely tie them up completely. This is something that the rogue can be using from the back rank, or somebody can be running around the edge of the battle and just tie somebody up to the point where the other players can now move in and finish them off.
And who doesn't want to be Indiana Jones in D&D?
Honestly.
Yep. Onto the martial ranged weapons, the interesting ones that you can shoot. First, we got the blowgun. This really didn't have as much of a...
I've never seen a single player in any of my campaigns even consider using this weapon.
I mean, I don't even know if I've had a monster use it or anything. This may even not be enough. But
I like to hope that we've given it enough changes here to make it worth using, and I'll explain why. This weapon,
it's one piercing damage,
not one dice.
No,
one singular. Uno.
It's got ammunition, of course, range of 25 feet or 100 feet, with disadvantage there. It's also got loading,
which only makes it worse.
Yeah, it's just as bad.
I would go so far as to say this may have been the worst weapon in the game.
Possibly, yeah, but.
So, with that in mind, we felt like it needed to make some changes happen here. But we didn't want to compromise the core integrity of what this weapon is. It's an assassin's weapon. It's a stealthy weapon. It's a weapon that's silent, that still only does 1 damage. We did not change that.
Nope.
But with that in mind, we gave it Razor's Edge, so it has a higher chance of critting. But when you think blowgun, you think poison darts, right? So we gave this weapon the best version of that we could. This has got the deadly poison darts ability. Poisons applied to this weapon's ammunition can coat 3 times as much ammunition as normal. Creatures have disadvantage on saving throws made against poisons coating this weapon's ammunition.
We didn't want to inherently make the poisons on it stronger. We wanted to make it easier to apply them.
Everyone who has ever taken a look at the poisons list in D&D knows that there are many options for poisons with various different damage types and damage numbers associated with each one. And the ones that your players can get their hands on is really at the DM's discretion of what they feel like dropping in their loot drop they're selling in their stores. With that in mind, This is a weapon designed to take those poisons and apply them to enemies stealthily.
Yeah.
I mean, a good shot from a blowgun coated in a potent toxin could drop an enemy in stealth just as easily as, say, a knife to the throat would.
Yep.
But that doesn't change the fact of what this weapon is a hollow tube shooting a tiny dart, and that's only going to do 1 damage intrinsically. Hopefully with that expanded crit range, those poisons will get their kicks in, because a crit with a dart covered in poison, hey, that poison damage, that's going to get part of that crit too, so don't forget that. But this is a very situational weapon, and I really hope that we'll see some use now on tables far and wide.
Yeah, I hope one of the rogues in my upcoming game uses
this could actually have a good use now. I think a rogue with a blowgun, sneak attack with a poison dart, they could do some serious damage.
Yes. All right, the next 3 we're actually going to run by kind of quickly here. It's the hand crossbow up next, which is 1d6 piercing damage. It's got ammunition, range of 30 or 120, disadvantage. It's got light and loading. So basically you just gave it pinning hit.
Pretty much. I mean, the following ranged weapons all function pretty uniquely on their own anyway. They each have a clear niche and a reason to use each one. And I thought that didn't need to get messed with, really. This weapon, the draw to it is the fact that it's light. It's the fact that you can take this in one-handed. You could dual-wield crossbows if you felt like it. And the pinning hit was just the cherry on top to make sure it functioned on par with all the other ranged weapons with the capability of pinning. Other than that, I didn't really adjust it.
Speaking of, we've got the heavy crossbow. This is a 1d10 piercing. It's got ammunition, range 100 or 400, heavy, loading, and two-handed. This is the bigger one.
Right. Of your ranged weapons, martial ranged weapons or otherwise, this is the one that has the highest damage dice. This is the one you'll most commonly see your fighters taking when they're looking to lay down some smack at long range. You can only make one attack with loading, but there is a handy feat called Crossbow Expert, which takes that and just goes to the side with it. So this weapon can really do some decent damage. It is one of the favored options for your ranged weaponry.
Now it's got pinning hit.
And now it's pinning hit, which is a static buff. So enjoy that, all you crossbow users.
And finally, we also gave pinning hit to the Longbow. This was a 1d8 piercing weapon. It's got ammunition, range of 150 or 600 with disadvantage, with heavy and two-handed. This is the super long range weapon.
Yeah, this is your sniper rifle option in D&D, really. I mean, this is the one that can reach out and touch targets further than any other weapon in the game.
Yep.
And with that in mind, pinning hit is a static buff to it. It and heavy crossbow have their own niches in the game already. They don't they compete with one another, but there are reasons to take one over the other already, and I didn't really feel like needing to make changes to either in this case.
And with pinning hit, the enemy will probably just use a medicine check to get out of it. At the worst, they'll get a few extra points of damage.
Yeah, I mean,
because you're that far away. If you happen to be sniping them while the rogue's up close, then they're, taking that extra damage and everything.
This is a fantastic weapon to pair with a feat like Sharpshooter, which really lets you capitalize on that 600-foot range. I mean, that's the real draw of this weapon. Because, let's be honest, if you're running a ranged character, unless you're playing something like an Arcane Archer that specifies you need to use bows, you're probably going to take a crossbow to get that Crossbow Expert feat, because in addition to losing the loading, you no longer have that penalty to being up close. But if you're looking to really stretch the range of what you can do and make the DM hate the fact that his mat doesn't have enough tiles to even cover it.
We've had a couple instances where we've used that.
Have. Yeah, the Longbow has its place.
Next up, we've got the only weapon on this list that has not received a single change. This is the net. It's got no damage and the thrown property of 5 feet or 15 feet and a special ability. Right.
The net intrinsically was a very unique weapon in the player's handbook already, to the point that I didn't feel like it needed any changes whatsoever. It does have a rather wordy special ability that I will read to you currently. A larger, smaller creature hit by the net is restrained until it is freed. A net has no effect on creatures that are formless, creatures that are huge or larger. A creature can use its action to make a DC 10 strength check, freeing itself or another creature within its reach on success. Dealing 5 damage to net, which has an AC of 10, also frees the creature without harming it, ending the effect and destroying the net. When you use an action, bonus action, or reaction to attack with a net, you can make only one attack, regardless of the number of attacks you can normally make. This ability applies even when you are not proficient with this weapon, which is the line we added.
Wow.
That's a lot of words.
Yeah.
Essentially, what you can do with this weapon is throw it at something up close and restrain it. And then proceed to do nothing else with your turn. It has a place in the game. I've rarely seen it used, but when it works, and it has its own place.
Especially with a big party. That being said, there are so many things you can do with a net that it was too much for me to include on this list myself. But suggestions that could be made on how to improve it, if the DM is looking to flavor things or drop unique items. Material is a big one. You can give them a net made of steel strands instead of a woven fiber, or perhaps adamantine, even if you're really looking to give them something that's going to make you hate combat encounters. I mean, you can give them different, or a barbed net and give it some damage, maybe a D4. There are ways you can improve it on a one-by-one individual basis. I feel like the net itself is more of like a template, similar to how like an arrow. Yeah, an arrow is a piece of ammunition. Yeah. But that doesn't mean you can't give your party fire arrows or frost arrows or explosive arrows or whatever else. It didn't really need more words.
Right. It has enough words. Yeah. You get the idea when you read it. The DM could homebrew from there. Take it as it is.
Yep. Speaking of the DM homebrewing something, for our next section, we actually have a little bit of a clause. These are the firearms. Firearms may not be available in your setting. No. In fact, I have played less settings where they are available or not.
Yeah, they're typically not available in my campaigns because my players usually prefer a more classic fantasy setting. But when they are available, they can be fun.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. And if it makes sense, or if you players just want it, just confer with your DM before using these. And
if your artificer gets extra creative, this at least gives you a direction of where to go with it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If he's the first one to think up a blunderbuss, then maybe he deserves it. Speaking of which, the blunderbuss is a piercing weapon. It's got a very special damage type we'll talk about in a second. It's got properties of ammunition, range of 15, 30, or 45. Again, I'll speak about that in a moment. Heavy, loading, and two-handed.
Right. So with the blunderbuss, I thought long and hard about how to make it. My first thought was, give it a cone. I realized that's not really how a shotgun works. It's not like it just goes out in front of you in every direction. It is a tight spread that moves forward. And with that in mind, I wanted its damage type to reflect that. And it has a special ability that reads as follows. This weapon has 3 range profiles, and its damage changes with each. Within 15 feet, this weapon uses 3d4 for its close range damage rolls, and makes its attacks with advantage. Between 15 and 30 feet, it uses 2d6 for its mid-range damage rolls. Between 30 and 45 feet, it's considered a long range and uses 1d12 for its damage rolls and makes those attacks with disadvantage. This ability applies even if you're not proficient with this weapon. The thought behind that is that when you pull the trigger on this weapon, you have a finite number of projectiles that come out in a cone. Therefore, at close ranges, you have a higher chance of doing damage on average because, most of those projectiles could hit the target, and similarly, you would have advantage on the attack. Mid-range, that spread is fanning out. Maybe some of the individual projectiles miss, so your lower overall damage will go down. Now you're at 2d6, and you don't have advantage anymore. If you're really reaching it at long range, you're down to a d12. It's fate now. Maybe they'll hit, maybe they won't, and you're making that attack with disadvantage, so who knows? Yeah. But I feel like that a lot. I feel like that really reflects the nature of the weapon. Up close, boom, it's hitting as hard as a greatsword. This thing is a cannon. Trying to stretch it a little further than you should, well, good luck.
And if you think that sounds really powerful, that's because it is.
Yes.
And it is 500 gold pieces.
Yeah, this is a firearm. This is a high-level piece of equipment. They're not cheap. They are high-tech, and like I said, they're not available in all settings. Yeah, but there is a secondary ability, and this ability applies to every single firearm on this list, so I'm just going to read it the one time, and it is the gunpowder ability. If this weapon is wet, its critical failure range is improved by 4. This weapon does not function underwater. This ability functions even if the wielder is not proficient with this weapon. What I mean when I say critical failure range is the same as the critical hit range, whereas on a critical hit is scored on a natural 20 and its critical hit range is improved by 1, meaning now 19 or 20. Critical failure is the same theory. Normally a critical failure is scored on a native 1. With this weapon, you would now score a critical failure on a roll of 1 through 5 if the weapon is wet.
Makes sense to me. Something this mechanical and this advanced probably has some drawbacks.
Side note with that, not every campaign uses critical failures. Use this ability at your discretion. In all of our campaigns we have, and in this packet we have included some rules about critical hits and critical failures as well that we will get to later.
Moving on to a little bit of simpler firearm, we've got the Flintlock Pistol. This one's worth 250 gold, half as much, and it's got 1d10 piercing, so static damage for this one. It's got ammunition, a range of 30 or 90, and it has light and the loading property.
Functionally speaking, this weapon is an improvement over the hand crossbow, and the cost is associated to match that.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any abilities, however, other than the gunpowder ability, which all firearms have. So you can't get your pinning hits with guns. Sorry, you can't nail someone to a wall with a bullet. It just doesn't work. So, yeah. Good damage, though, for a one-handed weapon with light, a D10. That's nothing to scoff at.
Exactly.
So, hits hard.
And finally, for the firearms, coming into the Flintlock Rifle. Very similar to the Flintlock Pistol, except it's a 1d12 piercing instead of 1d10. And it has ammunition, two-handed loading. The two-handed is new to this. And it also has a range of either 40 or 120. Yeah. So longer range.
Yeah, this is your bread and butter rifle. I mean, this is the standard musket that you'd see in the setting. So it hits harder than your Flintlock does. It's got more range than your Blunderbuss does. And it still has the gunpowder ability. I mean, the way I wanted to balance the firearms in general against the conventional ranged weapons in the game is that, yes, they do more damage. That makes sense. Static. They're guns. But they lack some of the properties like pinning hit that the other weapons have, and they have caveats they're used with gunpowder. I know the feat, firearm expert, I believe it is called, is an optional
gunner.
Gunner, thank you. The gunner feat is an optional feat in a lot of campaigns.
I believe you find it in Eberron first.
Yeah, I believe it did. An artificer gets proficiency with firearms. These aren't weapons that all characters will know how to use without a feat investment. So I feel like if you are willing to build your character specifically in that way and fork over the gold to acquire one, there should be enough of a benefit to weigh that. I mean, this isn't as easy as getting a longsword or a greatsword. I mean, the cost on these, I mean, a Flintlock rifle costs 10 times as much as a greatsword. That's a lot.
Yeah. Absolutely, and the amount of craftsmanship put in to build it absolutely makes sense for that.
Yeah.
Oh boy, wow, what a list! Yeah, we just have a couple more things we want to talk to you about, and then we'll say goodbye for today.
Yeah. In addition to all the new weapons and pre-existing weapons that we have on this list, we also included some handy references in the back, some basic things we can go over later. But the only ones I'd like to go through in detail are the rules on critical hits and critical failures. Critical failures are not something that exists defaultly in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and there are lots of homebrew rules for enacting them. For this list, we have our version of the critical failure homebrew rules. If that's not what you use in your campaign, say you're using failure tables or crit tables, you don't have to use these. These function separately from the interactions with the weapons. This is just what we use at our tables and what we feel like makes the most sense to us. Starting with critical hits, we use the standard critical hit rules from the player's handbook that go as follows. When a creature makes an attack roll and rolls a natural 20, it is considered a critical hit, and it automatically hits the target regardless of armor class. If an attack has any modifiers to its critical hit range, they are cumulative. For example, if a weapon has the Razor Edge ability and a feature of the attacker's class or some other item allows them to score critical hits on a roll of a 19 or 20, a player scores a critical hit on any roll of 18 or 20, for example, as we explained earlier. When you score a critical hit, you get to roll extra dice for the attack's damage against the target. Roll all of the attack's damage dice twice and add them together, then add any relevant modifiers as normal, for example, sneak attacks or smites or poisons. All that factors in. Pretty standard. We just included some of our own terminology there to make sure it works with the new abilities. Where things get a little weirder are our critical failures. Now, I've never been one to use critical failure tables at my table, but not to say you can't. I use a system that reads as follows. When a creature makes an attack roll and rolls a natural 1, the attack is considered a critical failure and misses the target regardless of any modifiers. If an attack has any modifiers to its critical failure range, they are cumulative, as in the gunpowder ability. That's the only one that we have listed here, but not to say you can't add more of your own. A DM may enforce the following rule. When you roll a critical failure, roll a D100. In addition to missing, the DM may decide to impose other repercussions depending on the roll of the D100. The higher the D100 roll, the worse the outcome may become. The reason I use this version of the rule as opposed to critical failures is because it gives me as a DM more agency on how I'm going to interact with my players depending on the circumstances. You're rolling a crit fail table, yeah, you rolled a 1, but something bad is always going to happen, and that really sucks. And that's not the case. I mean, you're dealing with skilled combatants. A fighter is supposed to be someone who's trained his entire life to fight, and I can accept the fact that, yeah, on any swing, he has a 5% chance to miss.
Yep.
Sure, that makes sense. You don't hit all your attacks. But to say that on any attack, you have a 5% chance of dropping your weapon, cutting off your hand, like,
leg.
That's ridiculous. Yeah. Come now. That's just not, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
This system allows you to gauge exactly how badly they messed up.
Yep. I think I've seen it once where somebody critically failed and then rolled a 100. And that was when they chopped off their own hand.
That gets bad. If you roll a 100 on a critical fail, the chance of that happening are super, super low, and the repercussions should match that rarity. But if they roll a crit failure and give me a 25, you know what I'm going to say? I'm probably looking to go, yeah, you missed. Move along.
Right, exactly.
Maybe if they get like a 60, I'll be like, okay, yeah, not only did you missed so badly, the creature gets to make a reaction, make an opportunity attack against you. I mean, like, you can play it by ear. If you're good at improvising and getting things on the fly, use this. Make it work. Yep. If you're not and you like crit fail tables, power to you. Use them at your leisure.
That being said, alongside those two little references that we wanted to discuss, the entire back half of the packet is showing all of the new things that we've enforced, including improvised weapons, shove action, silvered weapons, everything you may need to reference for
dual wielding.
For combat there, as well as all of the conditions in a list. The conditions also include the new pinned condition, which is a perfect little reference to show your players, as well as exhaustion and a couple other things for those players there. We are going to go ahead and, like I said, put that in the description, as well as the Discord for you to either follow along with or show one of your buddies, or just hand out to your players.
Yep.
And this can really spice up a game. I'd love to hear what you think about these. Which one is your favorite? What's your favorite new ability? Do you like the pin condition? Do you think it's overpowered, underpowered? Do you think that these are interesting? And how did it go in your game? Maybe enforce it for a session. Ask the players how they felt. We'd love to get some more feedback from this.
Yeah, let us know what works, what doesn't work, and please, if you guys have if any of these abilities come up in your games, you get some good stories, be sure to leave them in the comments down below.
Yeah, comments down below, and if you drop a couple interesting tidbits into the Discord server, we could absolutely update this booklet, have a discussion about it, maybe even plan a Roll20 game together. That's always a possibility.
Yeah, so if we don't get enough new, I mean, if you guys have ideas,
why don't we test it out together in a one shot?
Weapons that we missed, things you want to see added. If we get enough ideas, who's to say we can't do a version 2 of this packet later?
Yep, absolutely. So go ahead and subscribe for more of this content. I do content on all kinds of games, and you'll see more D&D from the two of us as well. So without further ado, have a great rest of your day.
Nice meeting you.